morning, everyone, and welcome to MindSpeak. It's great to see you all here. I hope you had a good breakfast. Just two things, housekeeping. We've got one more MindSpeak before the end of the year. That will be a musical MindSpeak with Aaron Rambui, who is the jazz fusion musician. He'll talk a bit about music, and also and it'll be a musical session. Pleasure to have you here, all of you here, and it's a pleasure to be hosting Frank Matsaert. Frank is a friend and was reminding me of when we first met, which was a number of years ago now, Frank. And I'm going to briefly give you an introduction. I've had some questions come over Twitter already, in particular about the chicken exports from Uganda, so we will deal with that in the Q&A session, I promise. Frank Matsaert has over 20 years of experience as a senior private sector development specialist with an extensive track record in strategy, program delivery, and management in 14 countries in Africa and 6 in Asia. Frank has been the CEO of TradeMark East Africa since October 2010. And prior to this was a private sector advisor for DFID and the country director for CARE. Frank started his career in the financial sector as an international fund manager and investment analyst in the UK. Over the years, Frank has designed and overseen over 40 major innovative and successful programs totaling over $1 billion in the fields of trade, financial sector development, privatization, investment climate reform, market development, and skills development. Frank holds 2 master's degrees in economics and in archaeology, and is an IMRO certified fund manager. Frank Matsaert, the stage is yours. Thank you.
It's lovely to be here today. Really delighted to be with you. And I've got a presentation here for you which I thought we could run through, which really talks a bit about where we are in terms of East Africa, in terms of the economics. I've got the quite optimistic title, Unleashing the East African Lion, as you can see there on the screen. And I'm going to kind of try to do a show of hands at the end of this presentation, whether you agree with that or whether you feel that that's maybe a bit too optimistic. So what I'm going to do is just run through really some of the good news, some of the challenges, and also then I'm going to just tell you a bit about what we do at TradeMark East Africa, because some of you may not be aware of that. So delighted to be here, ladies and gentlemen, and I think broadly in terms of the good news, what is the good news? Well, first of all, I think that our economies here in East Africa are growing quickly. I think we know that, between 5 and 8%. They may have slowed down a bit short term, but generally they're going really well. And I think people don't understand that actually 5 out of the fastest growing cities over the next 20 years are going to be here in East Africa. And that's going to be really quite a big urban transformation. You can see it here in Nairobi, where we are now, how much the city's grown. And I've been here now 8 years in Kenya, and you've seen huge changes. And I think we all know that this is going to continue. I think the other good bit of news is that income growth is accelerating. We're seeing the gradual emergence of a middle class. I mean, there was a report, I think last year, really looking at that dynamic. And I think the other interesting point is globally, what's going on in China is also affecting us here in East Africa. Labor costs have increased in China a lot, and our labor costs are now very competitive, and it's beginning to attract investment. And I can tell you a story later, if you want, of Chinese companies seeking to invest, for example, in Rwanda to produce socks. Socks are not very glamorous. We all have a pair of socks. But essentially, they want to invest in Africa, particularly in Rwanda, to actually tap the trade preferences for the US and European markets. So that's a very interesting dynamic, and I think offers a lot of potential for our region. I think as well, a lot of people always talk about extractives, and we've seen a big hit in the oil price, but the growth in Kenya and in East Africa is far more balanced. It's much more about consumer goods, as you know, retail, real estate, and a lot of innovation. Services are a very important factor for the Kenyan and the East African economy. But saying all that, extractives down the line could offer the potential for windfall gains. I think, we were talking a little bit with, I was talking with Ali Khan really about the issue of how the oil price collapse affects that kind of investment, which is, I'm sure, something we can talk about. So growth has been good, and there are a lot of positive aspects. There are good opportunities, really. And when you think about the regional market in East Africa, each individual country is pretty big, but think about the regional market as being a much bigger market. The potential for economies of scale and scope are really good. So, you know, we're talking about a consumer market of about 150 million. If you take the countries around East Africa, that's getting on for about 300 million. That's a really good consumer base. I think the other point is regional integration. I know that Ali, you've had Ambassador Sesabera, the Secretary General, on MindSpeak, and I think, you know, regional integration is making a difference. It is reducing the challenges to trading across borders, and I'll talk a bit about that dynamic. But also there are opportunities. Think about the free trade area, what they call the tripartite free trade area, between COMESA, SADC and EAC, a big consumer market from Cape to Cairo. And don't forget, we had the breakthrough in Bali. The US and India agreed on, in terms of some of the food price and food subsidies. The Bali trade agreement has moved through. And that's going to be a really big supporting factor, I think, for East Africa. We're going to hope to play a big part in actualizing that. I think, you know, not everything's not perfect, but there have been improvements to the investment climates around the region. I think generally the ease of doing business has improved. And I think that governments also understand the need to particularly invest in trade infrastructure and energy as part of a competitiveness strategy. What that means is the understanding that infrastructure pays. And I thought that was interesting I think on Twitter yesterday, interesting study from the IMF showing for every every 1% investment in infrastructure, within a year you get 0.5% return in terms of economic growth. Within 1.5%. So infrastructure does help growth. And this is an interesting picture. This is His Excellency President Kenyatta signing up on the Mombasa Port Charter, something that we've been supporting, to halve the time through the port. And with that, all the infrastructure. So this sort of political will amongst our leaders in East Africa is very strong. This is a picture of the President of Burundi. I was there about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and this is him breaking ground on the new one-stop border post at Kobero, Kabanga. And then this is a picture of His Excellency President Museveni. Basically, this is a trunk road that we're building connecting Uganda and Rwanda, and this is him flagging it off. I think those pictures tell quite a powerful story about the fact that our leaders in East Africa really are behind infrastructure development. And I've just popped this particular slide up for you to show you the kind of, what are we talking about when we talk about trade corridors. The kind of black line running from Mombasa up through Busia, Malaba, into Uganda, then on to Rwanda and Burundi, and a spur up to South Sudan. That's called the Northern Corridor. I think you all know it. It carries the bulk of the region's trade. It's very important for the Kenyan economy as the gateway. And then the Central Corridor is that kind of orangey color from Dar es Salaam running through Tanzania into the Great Lakes and also into Rwanda and Burundi. And those two corridors carry about 98% of our region's trade, okay? And 65% of GDP is generated within 10 kilometers of those two roads. Sorry? 65%. So this is these trade corridors are very powerful engines of our regional economy, and they're very important arteries for trade. And essentially, I'll talk about this a bit later, this is what we focus on at TradeMark. We've done some work as well with various folks really looking at, well, what's going to happen to trade over the next 20 years. And actually, this is a very conservative projection on the Northern Corridor. You can see that the blue line there, the blue bar, we've got about 4.5 times trade projected. That's how much trade will increase over the next 20 years. And essentially, that's a pretty conservative assumption because it doesn't take into account the oil in the Albertine Basin and up in Turkana. So we think we're just revising these now. It could be as high as 6 to 8 times on the Northern Corridor. So trade is really growing, okay? And the red bar is how much of that at the moment on the Northern Corridor goes through Mombasa Port. So most of it, as you can see. And then the green bar is how much of it at the moment goes by road. 96% of trade along the Northern Corridor goes by road. The standard gauge rail is a great development that will change that dynamic, but they're only projecting around 35–40% to go by rail down the line. So that still means, if you think about it, with a huge trade increase, that puts a lot of pressure on the infrastructure. And if you think about Mombasa, our port here in Kenya, it's operating at about 95% of its capacity. What will happen when this trade growth hits that? And it's an interesting point that we need to see the efficiency and the capacity of our trade infrastructure increase. That's really what you should take away from that slide. So there's high trade growth, and that's good news for the region. So that's kind of the good news story. What are the sort of challenges that we face, I think? Well, first of all, this is a nice diagram, I always like this one, of how big is Africa as a percentage of world trade. Less than 2%. So while all that's good news, we're still pretty small in terms of how trade is at a global scale. And I think, here are some of the challenges. They're not all of them. And, just to be realistic, we have to, counterbalance that really good news with being a bit realistic. And I think one of the big issues for us here in East Africa is actually lots of young people. I think something like 70% of the Kenyan population is under 30. So, jobs need to be created. And we don't have all the skills. I think we've got great skills in some places, but in some other places we need to develop them. I think the other thing that's a challenge is the red tape, and that is quite burdensome. It can also increase the potential for corruption. And I think, our investment climates, while they're getting better, they're still third quartile, still pretty much near the bottom. And I think, Rwanda, I think, has shown that you can really make huge progress quickly, but the unpredictability of our business environments deters investment, and this is quite a big problem. I think we have varying levels of competitiveness. I think there's a need for further value addition, and I think we all know that there are infrastructure and energy deficits. I think the average cost of energy for us here in Kenya, I think it's around 3 times that of South Africa. So, huge, that impacts your competitiveness and your ability to create jobs. I think the other thing I wanted to say, the trade costs are high. And I'll talk about that, but if you buy pretty much anything in Rwanda, 45% of the value of that good is just transport alone. Think about what that does to competitiveness and what that could do to growth. So it's still a problem. While there's been positive progress, high trade costs are still quite a big issue. I think the other point is some of the risks. We've had a good growth spurt, but our institutions, and I don't just mean bricks and mortar institutions, but institutions, rules of the game and markets, they need to be resilient. And what I think we've learned from Asia is that you've got to keep on reforming all the time. You can't just sit back and wait for it to happen. And it does require stronger and deeper institutions. I think there could be issues with the Dutch disease down the line in terms of over-reliance on certain extractives, and I could talk about that if you want. But I think the political commitment needs to carry on. And we've seen very good political commitment over the last couple of years, I think, particularly on the Northern Corridor. I don't need to tell you about the problem with terrorism. It was a terrible week for Kenya with what happened up in Mandera. I think I was shocked by that. But also we work in South Sudan. There's generally a conflict up there at the moment, and that's really a bit of a problem. 40% of Uganda's exports go to South Sudan. They've really tanked since the civil unrest there. And I think the last thing I wanted to say was really the other risk is, some people are benefiting more than others. And I know my good friend Aidan Iakuze would be banging on about this, but inequality is rising across the region. And particularly, if you take it at a macro level, the landlocked countries have benefited generally less than the coastal countries in terms of the regional integration process. We need to do something about that, and we need to do something about youth unemployment. And I think this is quite an interesting graph. This is an economic density map that shows basically economic density, particularly on the Northern Corridor. I don't need to tell you which place has the most economic activity. It's pretty clear, isn't it? Nairobi. But followed by Dar es Salaam and Kampala. But look at the rest of the region. It's pretty quiet, isn't it? And I think, this is something that we need to think about quite a lot as we go forward, particularly with the regional integration process. Okay. So high trade costs. Well, how bad are the trade costs? This is the World Bank doing indicators showing the cost to import, the blue bar, and export, the red bar. And I think you can see that the landlocked countries, Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda, have huge costs compared to Kenya. But Kenya is still very high. I think it's about $5,000 nowadays, I think, for importing a container for Rwanda. That's compared to China of less than 300. Less than 300. So just think about what that does, dollars, yep. So think about what that does to anything you're trying to export out of the landlocked countries. It really hits your competitiveness, doesn't it? And this is a big cap on our growth. I mean, people think that these trade costs are costing us 1 to 2% growth per annum. And these are big issues. The other thing is that this is a picture of the Central Corridor that carries a huge amount of our trade. I don't need to tell you about the state of it, and this is a major problem. And I think we all know this picture well from various parts of Kenya too. And this is a schematic of the major border on the Northern Corridor called Malaba, between Kenya and Uganda. Now, it's getting better, but at a bad time, that queue of lorries, trucks, can be 15 kilometers long going into the border. Each of those trucks costs about $500 broadly a day to put on the road. Some of them can wait there at a really bad time up to 6 days. So consumers are paying the price of this inefficiency, and the borders are a big issue for us in East Africa. And this is a breakdown of the cost structure, if you're interested. Why is it so expensive? Well, if you go to the left, you can see Mombasa Port, Nairobi, Kampala, Kigali, Bujumbura. So you pretend that you're taking a truck along the corridor, and the blue bar is how much of the cost structure is put in by delays. That's the cost of delays and time, okay? You can see it's most of it. And the interesting point, if you think about the mathematics, most of it is incurred at the port at Mombasa. So what does that say? There's a lot of delays at the port, okay? But the other things that are big delays are the borders, the things I just talked to you about, some of the red tape and the systems. The red bar is really the fixed cost of operating a truck, and you can see that that's pretty high. And generally our value chains in the trucking industry are pretty inefficient. Trucking prices are actually 70% higher than Europe. That shouldn't be the case, should it? And then the green bar is what we call operational costs or distance-based costs that increase as you go along. So that's the cost of operating a vehicle. The yellow bar, which is understated, is the cost of corruption. And we did a piece of work with Transparency International. It's probably about 7% of the cost structure is basically corruption and bribes. So what I'm trying to just, if you remember nothing from what I've said, because I can say a lot quite quickly, is that really the blue bar, the time-based cost, is something that you can really do something about. If you can make things quicker, you make it cheaper. And that's essentially the challenge that we try to address at TradeMark. So think back to the very high trade costs. And the reason for that is the delays, the cost of delays, the cost of inefficiency. Okay? So that's basically the kind of background I wanted to give you. I've talked to you about some of the pros, the good news, some of the challenges. We've got to be realistic, haven't we? And this is one of the biggest challenges, I think, for us as a region. And all of us try to attack it in our different ways. And this is essentially the challenge that TradeMark East Africa that I set up, or getting on for 5 years ago now, is really trying to address. Okay. So what are we? Well, we're actually Trade and Markets East Africa. We're not trademarks as in intellectual property rights. I get that question a lot, so please don't ask me that. Trade and Markets East Africa, we're trademark for short. TMEA, or TMEA as lots of people call us. We're actually a not-for-profit, and we're registered in all the partner states. Our head office is here in Kenya. I'm very proud that we're an East African institution. Although I'm a Mzungu, it's basically, we are here for the region. And we have branches in all of the 5 member states of the East African community. Excuse me. And we just opened a small office in Juba, which has been a difficult place to operate because it's applied to join the East African community. And we have an office in Arusha to work with the East African community. We're funded by a range of governments, 8 altogether, and they're there. And our budget from 2010 to 2016 is about $540 million. Okay, I'll talk about how that breaks down. And I'm already beginning to think about the next phase of our operation from 2016 to 2020, and we've got already about $90 million of commitments going ahead. We run about 165 projects across the region, so we're pretty big now. And Ali Khan helped to launch us and kind of get us going a few years ago. So when we talked then, I think we had about something like $150 million. So we've grown a lot over the last few years. So that's what we are. And our approach, I think, is a bit innovative. What we try to do is that, a lot of the time the regional parameter is set, the policies are set in Arusha but actually they don't implement anything in Arusha. They set the policy. You implement everything here in Nairobi. So the national implementation of a regional policy is really what we're trying to focus on. I did a lot of research designing TradeMark, and we looked at why regional programs fail. One of the reasons why is that you actually need to look at actually getting stuff done on the ground. So that's our approach at TradeMark. We also try to combine hardware investment, physical infrastructure, and you've seen some of it earlier, with software. So you have to, if you put into place a border post, you have to have a management change to make that border post more efficient. You see, you don't get the payoff from just putting in a nice border if you don't do that. It's like a road as well. If you have a supportive policy environment, that road is really useful for our region. So we combine the two, and we found that the impact of that is better. What we try to do is work in a really demand-led way. I used to work for the private sector. We try to run it like a private sector entity, being demand-led and fast and flexible. And really, we do everything through partners. I think the other thing is to say that we have a very good, a good system of governance where our national stakeholders oversee our national programs, and then we have a regional body at the regional. So it's that whole ethos of national to regional. And finally, I think we try to do a lot of work with the private sector, and we try to be very results driven. Okay, and this is kind of what we call our theory of change. And for folks who want to see it, we've got a kind of impact thing here, which lays this out on page 5. It goes down, I think you'll see, to many different levels, but don't worry about that. Have a look at it if you like. I'm not going to go down to all the detail today, but at the top of our theory of change, or how we'd like to see change happen, is poverty reduction. I think for us a big thing is job creation, and in the future I wanted to be doing a lot more on this. But we do that by increasing trade, and 3 aspects to increasing trade is really improving physical access to markets, enhancing the trade environment, and then increasing business competitiveness. And the idea is that that adds up to increased trade competitiveness. And it's based on quite a lot of research from the World Bank and others. So essentially that's our kind of our targets. And the kind of work that we do, well, we do a lot of work on the corridors. We build some roads. I think we do a lot of work on borders. We're investing $120 million in upgrading the 7 key border posts for East Africa. So at places like Malaba and Busia for Kenya, Taveta Holili, which is an important one, I think, down the line for Kenya. We're also doing a huge amount at the ports. And you saw the picture earlier of His Excellency signing the Mombasa Port Charter. That commits all the agencies at the port to halve the time through that port over the next 3-4 years. So we do a lot of work on the physical side. We're upgrading berths, we're repaving yards, we're extending the way that the port operates, and also productivity. We're working with actually the guys taking the boxes, the containers off a ship, stacking them, how do you stack them, and then how do you get it out of the port quickly? And so we're also investing in the Port Reitz Road, which is a connection road to get the boxes out, working with the Japanese on the new container terminal. So the ports are really important, and you saw why that's important because you understand it now, hey? That's why we're attacking that problem. And railways, do a lot of work on railways, particularly coming into ports. The standard gauge rail is really going to change the trade dynamics a lot. Those are some of the kind of things that we do in that image, and the kind of expected results that we hope to achieve are a 10% increase in trade, 25% increase in intra-regional trade, so that's trade within East Africa, and this is what we call the 15%, a big reduction of 15% in the time from the port to the point of destination. So if it comes into Mombasa, it would be for Nairobi, Kampala, Kigali, Bujumbura, Juba, along the way. Okay? Now, and then also from Dar es Salaam, because we do the Dar es Salaam, the central corridor. And most important, 30% decrease in the time through selected borders. Now, those are just some of our targets, but I say that and people go, that's not very interesting, Frank. That sounds pretty boring. But it's actually worth $17 billion of benefits for you as East Africans. It's a lot of benefit. And broadly, Ali's the financial guru, but it's about a $30 impact return for every dollar invested. So we think that's a pretty good return on development aid, which is often criticized, and I'm proud of that. I'm glad to say that towards the 15% indicator, we're already around 9-10% achievement. So, and we aim to achieve these by 2016. Some of the results, I'm not going to go through all of this, but I've told you a lot about infrastructure, but a lot of the big gains with trade are also down to electronic technology. And there are things called electronic single windows, trade here in Kenya, but the one in Rwanda that we worked on has reduced the clearance times. Actually, that's actually about 3.5 days to about 21 hours. So these are big gains. You can really reduce the cost. That's reduced the cost of a box, of a container, to import from $350 to $50. That's really, and that feeds through to consumer prices. So it has a big effect. In Uganda, $56 million in terms of the new, in terms of savings, just for that alone, that cost us around $3 million in terms of investment. And that again is for a custom system, not quite an electronic single window, but it's having a big effect. And what's not here, and I'd love to show you sometime, is the electronic cargo tracking system that's now in Uganda, where containers and trucks are actually tracked 24/7. We've worked with the Uganda Revenue Authority on that, and it's just been quite revolutionary. Driver productivity has doubled. So people who operate trucks now say, "Why are you waiting there, truck driver? You know, why are you waiting there?" And it's really speeding things along. So the technology is making a big difference. And I'm glad to say here in Kenya, we're working with KRA to replace the old Simba system that is pretty can have problems with reliability. Then in terms of region integration, standards are a big thing. Okay, you've got to have good standards that are harmonized to allow goods to move. But we've harmonized around $300 million of those in the last year. And that will allow goods to move without any stopping at borders. And we've also, I think quite important, developed a legal sanction mechanism. We're supporting the Secretariat, the EAC, to put that into effect, so that if a country doesn't play ball, it can be taken to court. And we found in Europe that was the only way to do it. The big one for us in Burundi, we helped to establish the revenue authority there, and that's actually doubled the revenues of the country in 3 years. It's about an additional $375 million for our investment of 20, so it's been a good yield. And it's meant that about 40,000 people a year in Burundi now get access to health services that didn't before, and that's financed from their own tax base. And we're proud of that. Anyway, I won't go on, but you can see that we've been doing quite a lot of work on infrastructure and a really interesting PPP, public-private partnership in Rwanda, looking at logistics. And here in Kenya and around the region, we do a lot with the private sector. You might have seen that we launched a Logistics Innovation for Trade Fund, which is trying to get innovation into logistics. We managed to raise $16 million for that fund. Any of you in technology, prick up your ears. That's a good level of area for investment. And we want businesses, East African businesses, to apply for that and really to get innovation into the logistics space. But we do a lot with the private sector, and the Secretary General, who we've had on before, we also supported what we call CEO roundtables to get them CEOs to talk direct to the policymaker, Secretary General. That's just a picture, but in here, there's a whole compendium of the kind of impact that we're having. And I think it's substantial. And I think, what's been exciting for me is creating TradeMark with so much resources to put to one problem. And I think you can see that it's having good effect. In aggregate, I was saying to Ali, when we started, it used to take 18 to 20 days to get a container to Kampala. It now takes 6 days. And that's a big improvement. And I mean, I think, people who don't know that, that's quite a silent revolution, really. Okay, so let me I think I should pretty much draw to a close as I've been going on a bit. But essentially, I thought it was just worth thinking, leaving you with maybe the 3 things that I'm thinking about for the future for TradeMark. Because we tried to set up TradeMark with really a 15 to 20 year outlook. It's not something that's going to come and go. It's something that's going to be there to support the region. And the first is to continue with our USP of reducing trade costs. There's more to do to realize the full customs union. But there's also a lot to do in terms of improved trade facilitation. And the Bali trade agreement, I think, moves that forward nicely. Second area is really to focus on informal trade. We often talk about trade, but is that benefiting the big companies like Bidco, or does it actually help the small trader at the border? So we want to have more of an informal trade program, particularly looking at women traders. And I think this is important because informal trade, small businesses are the bulk of our businesses in the region, and informal trade is almost as large as formal. So we need to get to grips with this. And the final bit is really to think a bit creatively about what trade infrastructure the region needs to create millions of jobs. And how are we going to do that? Do we need to right-size our infrastructure, improve it in certain areas to help that? And we're going to be doing some spatial work. It's a bit complicated to say it shorthand, but I can say more later. Really about trying to think about, to support Kenya's growth, what infrastructure is really going to be needed. And the aim would be to create millions of jobs and basically to carry on inducing trade and reduce poverty. And I'm going to be, with my team, designing this over the next year. And we'll be doing consultations in Kenya, so come and join in and give us your views. But really, I think this is the sort of question we want to be asking ourselves. Should the Northern Corridor be, at the moment, it's maximum of 4 lanes, but should it be 6 lanes, or indeed, should it be 10? Should we be thinking a bit more ambitiously about what our trade should look like down the line? And I think oftentimes we don't think ambitiously enough. And given the way that trade is going to grow, the way that the economies are growing, what is needed? And I put that question to you. How should we transform our trade? What should that look like spatially? So something perhaps for you to think about. I'd be interested to get your reactions. And I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much, Ali Khan, for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.
Okay. Can I sit here?
Yeah. I learned a lot of stuff, and I've got to, I am a trader at heart. So what I've learned is I've checked, and I was telling you, Frank, if you think of 2 road projects like the Thika Superhighway, and there's another one in Kwale that I visited, and you look at the economic returns, for example, in real estate, this infrastructure is so transformative. Frank, before I go to the audience for the questions, and thank you so much for that excellent talk, which had so many interesting dimensions, I've got to deal with our friend Aidan, who has very kindly sent us some questions over Twitter, and I will take others. Aidan runs a think tank called SID East Africa. And Aidan was asking, he said you were walking in the highlands of Ethiopia, and he said, what future did you see for East Africa? I know you've told us a lot already, but I'll put that question. And then he was also asking about this debate that's been in the paper where President Museveni said we're not allowing Ugandan chickens into Kenya, and that kind of behavior in a single community is not right. So if you can possibly address that, and maybe I can tack on one question as Frank goes to the questions. Has anyone got a question?
Thank you very much for that well-articulated presentation on trade. My name's George Mngao Konji from the civil society. Now, I won't go into details. I'll just need some verification on what you do at the with our borders. You talked of having invested $120 million US in our borders to curb the delays, and to that effect, you have managed to get 30% of the delay down from moving a container from Mombasa to Kampala, which used to take 18 to 20 days to 6 days. What exactly do you do at the borders? Because I come from Malava, and I just wonder, what is right at the border without fear or whatever is corruption. Corruption is the one that makes the trailers delay. Corruption. Now, are you trying to curb corruption by reducing it by 30%? How about the 70%? Thank you. I don't know whether you...
Are you importing goods across the border?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
I think, first of all, to answer your question at the border, well, what do we do? Okay, at Busia, which is just next door to Malaba, we're completely remodeling the infrastructure, so rebuilding the border post. We're working with the World Bank, who are leading at Malaba. And then what we do is we try to bring all of the agencies working at the border on one electronic platform, and basically linking up with the customs systems, so that basically there's an electronic corridor of the papers that can be seen straight at the border. So that's one thing. And then multitasking between the agencies, okay? Malaba actually has done much better than many other borders where customs and other agencies multitask. But there's a long way to go. And it's what's called integrated border management, where you bring together, for example, a customs official doing a variety of tasks that used to be done by lots of different agencies. And the net result of that is to reduce time, okay? The idea of the electronic systems are that you don't need to then have the physical trade documents that kept trucks waiting for a very long time. But the other stuff that we're doing at the border is we're working with, for example, women traders to let them know what their rights are. Because with most goods, there shouldn't be any charge to move things across borders. But oftentimes you find that people don't know that, and customs officials try to extract money. And I think it's really important that people know their rights. So we've been working at some of those borders. At Busia, for example, we've got a center there for small traders. And we want to do more in that direction. But I think the last thing I'd say is that we're also now going to be issuing figures on a regular basis, the efficiency of these borders, and doing SMS-based system surveys of truck drivers to find out if they did start to pay, if they've had to pay bribes or informal payments. So that's the kind of work that we generally do at borders.
Do you have a system? Do you know, for example, if people are being charged extraneous fees, would you know that, Frank, or is that not your job to police that?
Well, it's something that we don't really have full control over as an agency, but what we're trying to do is get more and more data on it.
I mean, just data gathering, yeah.
That's right. And so we piloted with Tanzania an SMS-based system that reports NTBs and then crowdsources it, I think, using the Ushahidi platform, an East African software solution. We want to do the same basically for paying bribes at borders. So we just started that work. So that's kind of what we're planning. And I think half the battle with trying to reduce corruption is information. That's an important dynamic. So I hope that answers your question, Jose, but come back to me if not. Okay, and what about the Ugandan chickens? Well, Aidan, if you're out there, you love to ask tough questions, don't you? I think it's a good question. I mean, at the general level, we did actually investigate this. I only got the question last night, but already we've been in touch with the Kenyan authorities. We've asked them, well, is there a policy decision not to allow Ugandan chicken into the Kenyan market? No, there is not. Then I think we went to the Livestock Institute and find out again if there's some sort of phytosanitary or poultry disease problem. No, there is not. And then my team even went to the border at Malaba and Busia, talked to the customs officials there. Is there a constraint on imports of chicken? No, there is not. Okay, those are the official answers. I think there may be a problem, and when I read the newspaper article, I think it was on Twitter last week, it was really talking about one producer that President Museveni, His Excellency, was just opening, I think, a factory of. So it may be something down to that individual trader. There may be a phytosanitary issue. That means there may be an issue with the hygiene of the factory, the quality of the chicken. But really, I think officially there's no curb on any imports. But I think the important point to take away from that is that trade is constrained by what we call non-tariff barriers. You know, you can have an import or a technical constraint put on trade, and it can have a very negative effect. And again, I think information is key. So what we've been doing is investing with each country to create what we call a non-tariff barrier reporting system, like the one in Tanzania. But there's a committee in each country that looks at this, and essentially it's tracked all the time. And I think you can see that if that chicken problem becomes a huge problem, there's then a legal route to remove it, okay? And the other thing is we want those chickens to move across the border, maybe not alive, but whatever. And, you know, actually getting a standard agreed between all of the East African countries on what a dressed chicken should look like, or day-old chicks, which actually I think has been agreed already, is really important. So these are the sort of dynamics that allow trade to happen. Now, there might be a small problem here and there with some of that, but essentially that architecture is beginning to work. And I mean, there's been a big reduction in what we call non-tariff barriers. So I hope that answers that one. But yeah, no, I'll be watching chickens very closely from here on in. Okay, I mean, every year I do a walk for charity. This year I did it for famine victims in South Sudan. And I had the pleasure of going to Ethiopia, which is really a very interesting country. And we walked in a place called the Simeon Mountains. So, You couldn't quite see Kenya from there, but it was pretty high. We got to the top of the highest mountain in Ethiopia called Rastatian. And I guess, you know, what did I sort of think of? Well, I had quite a lot of time to reflect, and I thought, well, wouldn't it be great if Ethiopia joined the East African community? I think it would make a big difference to the size of the regional economy, the size of the regional market. And Ethiopia is really transforming itself at the moment. Very high rates of economic growth, quite a different model of economic development. So I thought that would be interesting. But then I also thought, you know, actually the future looks bright for us in East Africa, because as we integrate our economies, we reduce these trade barriers, and we think about East Africa as one geographical space, there's a lot of opportunity there. And there really is a lot of potential growth. So I came away feeling very optimistic, but I think the key challenge really is to create the jobs. And that's the key challenge, I think, for all of the countries concerned.
I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. The Northern Corridor, what is the value of the formal trade and informal trade? Number two, do you have problems with the exchange rates or currency exchange problems between the borders? And number three, DRC is a very important market in a lot of our East African borders. Is there anything you're doing with the DRC and the border towns? I know it should be a good, I think Rwanda and Uganda, Tanzania, in fact, a lot of the exports go into the DRC.
Thank you. My name is Lawrence Njehia. I'm an undergrad student at Strathmore University. I have a question. One of the bullets, Frank, that you presented on caught my eye under emerging results, and it was under revenue, how you created 110% increase in national revenue collection from 2011. I think that is in
Burundi.
Sorry, Burundi, yeah. What caught my eye was the 40,000 people you helped access healthcare. I'd like to know from you what processes or controls or systems did you leverage to do that, or in general, if it's not one of those, what did you action to do, to do that? Thank you.
My name's Deborah Mugero. You've just mentioned that you are intending to create 1 million jobs. What systems are you going to use when the investors are not willing to put in their investment in this country because there's a lot of insecurity?
So your question is about creating funding in the event that investors don't want to come because of insecurity?
Yes, please.
Thanks a lot for those questions, really interesting. Maybe I'll answer the Burundi question first, if that's okay. Well, I mean, what did it, I think you asked really what did it involve and what processes. Oh gosh, I've been doing this now 8 years, altogether, and I went to Burundi back in 2007 when they were just thinking about joining the East African community. And one of the big things was they had 43 government departments collecting revenue, okay? And there was, how should I say, a lot of that wasn't quite ending up where it should have done. And there was quite a big problem with that collection rate. So what we did initially was the Burundian government, and I think it's a real testament to their commitment to the EAC, decided to set up a new revenue authority, which is really what they would call the more East African model of collecting revenues. The old Francophone model is through a Ministry of Finance and lots of different agencies. So they decided to go with that, and initially we worked with the IMF and the bank and the government to set up the law, okay? And a lot of help from Rwanda and Uganda to help that happen. And then from there, it was about setting up the institution, okay? And there it was about recruiting staff, institution building. Those processes are not easy in some contexts, I'll put it that way. Shorthand for that was quite a tough process. And then bringing in a new CG, streamlining all the legal sides, getting payments online. Those are the kind of things we had to do. And then at the borders, bringing in the new customs management system, it was all paper-based before, and getting rid of trade distortions. Now, that was a long process, and it's taken 4 years to get to where we are, but the process has been good, and I'm very proud that now the leadership of the Revenue Authority, it's called the OBR, the Office Burundais des Recettes in French, sorry about my French, but that's what it is. And essentially OBR now has really strong Burundian leadership because an expat was there as the first CG. So, the institution's come a very long way in a short amount of time. There are still challenges. There are trade distortions in the trade environment that are getting worse. But the authority, I think, is now quite resilient. That's what it took. And the case study is in that publication. We tried to follow the money, and we ended up with healthcare. And that's basically the methodology that we took. So I hope that answers your question. But if you're interested to know more, just let me know. Okay, and then what was the other question? Oh yes, okay. Well, the value of the trade, I was trying to do my mathematics there. It's about 25 million tons, I think, last year. In terms, you asked the volume of trade on the northern corridor. So I think it's about 25 million tons. And the value would be about $4 billion, I think. And basically DRC, yeah. Well, DRC is really important, particularly Eastern DRC is, but you know, those figures, I have to double check the exact figures, but broadly that's what it is. You know, DRC is really important, and the Eastern DRC is part of our trading network. It always has been, but obviously the other part of DRC is part of the West African trading network. And I think, you know, it's often a challenge to try to synchronize some of the policies and so forth in DRC with us, okay? So there's quite a challenge at those borders, particularly because there's also a lot of trafficking of people, illicit goods come across, you know the issue of blood minerals. So those borders are quite contested spaces, and there's a lot of, in the Kivus, you know, it's not an easy place to be. So what the approach we took was we were asked to look at those borders and to develop them, for example, Ruzizi, but there's about 4 or 5 main ones. But we felt that without having a base in Kinshasa, for the reasons I've just said, it would be very difficult to really affect change. Because when you do a border, you've got to do both sides. You can't just do one side, because you don't get the impact, okay? So we figured that we didn't have the base in Kinshasa, so we don't actually target those borders ourselves at the moment. And also they're not part of the EAC, which is our operational territory. Saying that, they're essential. And so what we've done is we've upgraded all the borders on the East African side, okay? And in Rwanda at the moment, we're just expanding our work with cross-border markets, where a lot of informal traders are coming over to Rwanda. They need facilities to do their trade really well, and we're doing a lot on that. And similarly, what we're doing is coming up with what's called a simplified trading regime. Right? Don't want to get technical, but essentially this is a set of rules and procedures that small informal traders can just come across and do business without any hassle. So we're putting a lot of effort into that, and Rwanda and Burundi are particularly keen on making themselves logistics hubs for the DRC. So we're supporting that process. So while we're not working on the borders ourselves, actually we're doing quite a lot of work to improve around that. So I hope that answers your question. But you asked about the currency issue. I think the East African community have agreed a monetary union protocol, as you know, and that's going to be brought in over quite an extended period of time. I think we'd all like to see one East African currency. It would reduce costs. But there are big trade-offs, and I think, you know, I come from Europe originally. You'll know that there are quite big trade-offs with the experience we had there with a single currency. And I think the good thing is the EAC is kind of mindful of that. So I hope that answers your question.
Can I just, sorry, interrupt quickly? You said the Northern Corridor is $4 billion of activity on that corridor at the moment. Your projection, because I was facing this way for the next 5 years, is what sort of projection?
Well, next 20 years,
yes.
We project that could increase by about 5 or 6 times. Yeah. Now, but we're just reworking all those statistics now. But you know, there's going to be large levels of trade growth. The model suggests that by 2030, from around I think it was 20 million tons to about 90 million tons. But I personally think it'll be higher than that because of the effect of extractives. Yeah. That model was done before we had that. So we're just reworking those numbers now.
I've got a question over Twitter talking about, are you doing anything for the livestock infrastructure business in this region? Or is that beyond the scope of TradeMark?
Well, what we are doing is looking at standards to support that. I mean, we talked about poultry earlier. Yeah. I think that the same really goes for other forms of livestock. And yes, I mean, what we're trying to do is improve the front end at the port so that basically the export of meat or live livestock can be facilitated. Are we doing anything to address livestock specifically? Those are the sort of enabling actions that we're taking. Otherwise, I think, you know, in terms of actually looking at the livestock value chain, we're not really operating there at the moment.
And the question that we didn't forget about is about insecurity. And I suppose, you know, first of all, let me share my, you know, it is awful to see what's been happening, and I really pray for the souls of all the departed who have really nothing to do with anything, as far as I can see, other than being in the wrong place in the wrong time. And I sincerely hope that we manage to do something about it. You know, I think we all wish for the same. Now, obviously, it's impacted. I come from Mombasa, and, you know, tourism has been taking a big hit. Is it slowing down investors? Is it slowing down, you know, how do you read it, Frank?
Well, I think it is slowing down investment, Ali. I think you're absolutely right, and particularly at the coast, tourism has been badly affected. But I think generally, you know, what we're seeing, which I think is really sad, is that investment that could have come to Kenya is now people are questioning that. And, you know, I think we've all got to kind of come together and fight this thing. It's very important that we do, but it is deterring investment. And certainly, you know, also when I talked about security, it's also, you know, for example, South Sudan, that threat of civil conflict up there is really affecting investment very heavily. So I think it is. I think the other question that we got was the 5 million jobs. I'm sorry.
Yes.
How would we raise the investment? I think that was your question. Well, I think the good news, I had a board meeting last week. That's probably why I'm looking a little tired. And essentially, our donors have agreed to already start thinking about extending investment. But what I'd really like to do, I was saying to Ali Khan, is to set up a capital fund where we would attract really investment that would help to leverage some of the roads that we need, improve ports that we need, and really get that moving to get behind employment growth. So I don't think we're just going to be looking at traditional donors, we're also going to be looking beyond that. So if the investment doesn't happen, I guess it doesn't happen. That's the bottom line. But you know, our experience has been that if you've got a good product, you can show that you've got good experience, you know, you're having impact, that investment flows. So I'm not too worried about the future. My aim will be to raise about another 500 million in the next phase of our operations. And you can see already, we're about 90 million there already.
Can I just add two questions, Frank? You know, one is that the World Bank for a long time was saying the average per capita wage now in China is much higher than in Africa, and that therefore a lot of these jobs should be coming towards East Africa in particular. I think Justin Lin, who was the World Bank president then, said because of the route to the sea, this sort of place would be a perfect. Are we seeing any of that actually happening? And then my second question is, if we look at the audience here, I would say we're young people, entrepreneurial. Where would you tell us to go to find opportunities in our region? What sort of areas would you say, guys, look at this is going to change? Just two sort of slightly tangential questions.
I mean, I think Justin's made quite a lot of that argument about the labour costs, and I think we are beginning to see it. But I think we're beginning, it's interesting that the first place I've really seen it is Rwanda. Now, why would Rwanda be the first place that you'd see that?
45% more expensive.
Exactly, so the economics, but what's going for Rwanda, apart from, you know, being a great country, it's a lovely place, the investment climate is really much better than other parts of our region. And I think that that's important for us to take away, is the predictability of the investment climate is really important. You don't need to give tax holidays. You don't need to give subsidies to investors. What they want is a simple, uncorrupt investment climate. And if they get that and it's predictable, they invest. So I think that's quite an important point to make. So that, you know, because you could ask yourself, it would be better for that investment to have found its way to, say, for example, the Kenyan coast or the Tanzanian coast. So I'm not saying that that's the reason why they decided to go there, but it's certainly, I know it was one of the key issues. So yes, we are beginning to see that, Ali, and I think we could do a lot more to attract that kind of investment. Which goes to your second question, what areas? Well, I think the the kind of myth that our growth is driven by extractors is we all know that that's really not true. There's huge amounts of growth in telecoms. I mean, look at what M-Pesa's done for our country and for the region. We've seen huge expansion in retail. Okay, I mean, look at the way that Nakumatt has expanded through East Africa. I was in Kigali, just the day before yesterday, and really doing well. It's the key supermarket for everyone in Kigali now. So that's a Kenyan company. I think the other areas that are growing very fast are obviously services, and I think one of the mainstays of our economy here in Kenya are services exports. So I think there's a lot of potential for further technology, a lot of potential for services to be exported, particularly adding value through a regional lens. So if you think about a traditional safari to Kenya, could you tag on the gorillas, for example, in Rwanda? Could you tag on chimpanzees in Uganda? That's the sort of additionality I think that could be thought through. And I do believe actually that the region has a really good, well-educated workforce. There could be more light manufacturing and processing. And we're beginning to see that happening. I mean, I think it used to be the case that we used to send a lot of horticultural items out by air freight, and the value was pretty low. Now it's packaged, it's clean, it's often processed. There's been a gradual increase in the value addition. And those sort of linkages between some of our key economic sectors and manufacturing is where I think there's a lot of potential.
Good morning.
Morning.
My name is Vanita. I'm a business leader who's just focused in bridging American companies with suitable African markets. And I've had my background in financial services and technology, especially leveraging technology to enable the business to find their profitability, basically. So data is very important to me. To that end, I wanted to find out from TradeMark, how well are you tracking the initiatives you've done? Most importantly, are there results that are effective, repeatable? What are the lessons learned that you've kept from the projects that you've done? And how would you build out that technology solution to leverage other markets, maybe in Africa? And then my second part is, obviously with my background in the United States, a lot of companies hear this opportunity in Africa. They hear we have a good workforce that's educated. However, they still don't see that connect and seeing that there's an opportunity that they're missing. Even if you share the story of M-Pesa, it took me almost 4 years to sell that story, that really this is a huge opportunity. It's growing. It's something that's not being done anywhere else, and obviously now everybody's copying it around the world. How do we sell that story, and how is TradeMark leveraging the growth opportunities in Africa and selling that to, let's say, American companies that don't have any knowledge of sub-Saharan African opportunities? And lastly, in the United States, we really focus on diversity. We want more diversity. We believe that that's where innovation begins. However, my experience has been that East Africa is so diverse that sometimes it could be a barrier. So I wanted to hear from you, what are your thoughts about diversity in East Africa, and how is it a barrier, how is it a benefit in East Africa, and where do we go with all the diversity? Do we try and simplify maybe the language? Do we simplify the policies, processes we're doing around East Africa? Just talk about that. Thanks.
Can I take one more?
Good morning. My name is Daniel. I'm a journalist. Now, going back to diversity, and I'll look at it a bit differently. TradeMark's, East Africa is a very wide area. What's your scope? What particular areas are you in? What should you specify? Kind of like specializing, yeah? Because otherwise it would be very wide, from poultry and chickens to development projects, as we've seen. And again, going by the European Union, for instance, do you think that we should be concentrating on 6 or 7 countries, yeah, in the EAC, or we should look at the wider area, go a bit southern, Western a bit, and probably we are not doing anything with the Arab world within the African continent. Thank you very much.
I think the key thing is investing in mass transport. Because if you look at like the image you showed us, asking should you have a 6-lane or 10-lane, an example is Thika Road. We invested in like 8 lanes, but currently the road is already clogged. So my opinion is invest in mass transport like railways, and when you showed us the chart on costs, the time implication was the highest cost. So mass transport is key to bringing down the cost of trade in this region. Number 2, my question is, what is your opinion with regards to the Eastern African countries investing in the SGR vis-a-vis repairing and properly maintaining the current railway, whereby you find like a country like Kenya, we can't really say that we are fully utilizing the existing railway system, but we are now investing in very capital intensive SGR. What is your opinion with regards to this? Thank you.
Thanks. Really interesting set of questions on a Saturday morning. No, I'm joking. I think maybe to answer your question first of all, how big should the EAC be? I think that's kind of what you were asking me, and I guess one of the real strengths of the EAC is the partner, the country buy-in. Okay, and at the moment being 5 countries, that's really strong. When you compare that to, say, other bigger ones, you tend to find that the country buy-in is lower, okay? But then you tend to find that the central force is stronger, if you see my point. So I certainly feel that my gut feeling is that the community could certainly expand further. And obviously, the countries around will be the first folks that would want to, or the first countries that want to join. South Sudan has applied to join. I don't know whether you know that. It obviously has huge challenges at the moment. I was just in Juba 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I'll give you an example. We've worked to set up the customs service. All right, there was no customs service before. It used to be operated by the North. Revenue was, I think, $6 million a month. All the rest was huge oil revenues. Okay, and when we started to train customs officers, we realized that 65%, I think no, actually 70%, could not read. So that's the sort of capacity challenge that you're dealing with there. I mean, I'm glad to say that now I think there's been 1,000% increase in the customs revenues as a result, but, obviously from a low base. But I think that's the sort of challenge as a region we need to be mindful of. Okay, so bringing South Sudan into the communities should take quite some time because of that capacity challenge in certain areas. So, I mean, South Sudan's applied to join. Ethiopia would be another neighbor where I think, particularly in terms of trade, huge potential. The big question, I think, is DRC, because, Eastern DRC is part of our trading network, Western isn't. So probably on balance, that would be something to think through. And then I think some other countries that around us might also be interested to come. But that would be the natural expansion. So I always think about it geographically rather than a numbers game. But you don't want a community to get too big, because then that partner state buy-in is reduced. But I think that's quite important. That's a really interesting question. And really be thinking naturally as well of what sort of cultural links East Africa has with those countries. And I think I was asked a question about diversity, I think, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, indeed, and I think that was your good question about diversity. How diverse should a community be? Well, I think diversity is a good thing, and it adds to obviously the richness of our regional culture. I think one thing that really binds the region is language, common language like Swahili, and I think that's really important. So. But the diversity is also important. I mean, bringing in, for example, countries like Burundi with more of a francophone background adds to the richness. So I think diversity is good, and I think we can benefit from it a lot, actually. I work in TradeMark. We're a very diverse lot. There are 14 nationalities in my team. They're folks like me who are foreigners, but we have all the East African nationalities, and actually we find that's a real strength. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question a bit about diversity. In terms of links with I think you asked me particularly with the Gulf, and the US. Yeah, I think I mean there are more trade links than you think actually with the Gulf, and most of our shipping actually comes via the Gulf because we're not on the main shipping lines. So pretty much every container goes via the Gulf for Kenya. And I think that's something that's important. There's a huge amount of trading that already is going on that you may not be aware of. And certainly with the US, the AGOA trade preference should help grow that trade a lot.
You were mentioning a business which was
Yeah.
deliberately targeting that AGOA. Yes.
I think so, and it touches to your question really about East African exports to the US. I think AGOA could be a very powerful instrument, and actually we're seeing investment coming in to look at that. And I know entrepreneurs like Jazz Betty in the garments trade do a lot of business with the US based on that trade preference. So I hope that answers that question. You said TradeMark is very wide scope. Well, I put back to you, sir, that trade covers a lot of different things. Yeah? Trade covers many goods and lots of things that are traded. We don't specialize particularly in chickens. I've got to tell you that as a question that we're asked, but I don't spend my time investing in Ken Chick or poultry businesses. What we do is we look at the things that can unlock trade, okay? And we think that's really around, number one, infrastructure and getting that right. Number two is really around policies, procedures related to trade. And the third area, I personally think, is using technology to transform that. One thing we are looking at, given that a lot of the benefits have come to the coastal countries, in the landlocked countries, our units there are beginning to think about a landlocked program that will help some of the key export value chains. We're just piloting that. But actually we're quite focused. We have 165 projects, but they are within this theory of change that's in that booklet in front of you. So, I can certainly get my head around it, and if I can, I think you can. So it's pretty focused, and we actually closed down 40 projects because we felt that they were a bit peripheral over the last year. And then I think you asked a lot about the role of technology and the impact stuff, and then I'll come to that mass transport question. Well, how do we track all our initiatives? First of all, we've got a pretty good M&E system that looks at the baseline before, and basically we then track the progress after. And at the moment, our investors are actually putting together really quite a complex evaluation where we bring in independent people to look at the impact of the work. But the figures that I've given you have come from our partners and independent verification. So the impact of the single window and the electronic cargo tracking. But the role of technology, I think, is critical. And I do think we've got a great story to tell in this region, a lot of innovation happening. And I think we need to find better ways of communicating that. Now, I think one way, if I'd have had time, I've got a video that I can put on YouTube about the impact of some of this. And I think if you're asking my advice, I don't know, I would say that I think if we can make, I tend to find that people in capitals find trade a very theoretical thing. So what I tried to do in the presentation for you is to make it real by showing you images of the things that affect trade. And I think if we can bring very specific examples of how technology is being used to improve lives and improve competitiveness here, I personally think we go a long way. So Ushahidi is a very good example of a great innovation, as is M-Pesa. So,
does everyone know Ushahidi? It was the crowdsourcing at the time of the election. You could SMS if you saw something happen. It's in fact what's going on Twitter now in many ways. But I was telling Nishat, you know exactly where the traffic cops are now because somebody's telling you. It's quite extraordinary.
It is quite extraordinary. And, and I think the other thing you said to me, how do we sell the story? Where do we go? Well, actually, the week before last, I was in the UK House of Commons talking to MPs. This week, I was in Tanzania at the beginning of the week talking to parliamentarians again from the UK Parliament. I was with the WTO recently where we actually presented a lot of this work. So we're trying to, we do quite a lot of outreach all over the world really in terms of what we're trying to do. So I kind of hope that gives you, but if you want to know more, just kind of ask us. some of the impact evaluation has to be very rigorous. And some of the requirements from our donors can be really quite onerous because you have to be very sure of what you're trying to do and the control groups and things like that. But I shan't bore you with that anymore. In terms of the mass transport question, I'd go with you on that. I think certainly mass transport, I don't know whether you know, but there's a huge new mass transport system being put into effect in Dar es Salaam. Is there? Yep. I think it's called DART. And that's been a very big investment from the World Bank and others. The private sector's getting behind that. But there's been quite a lot of, there's been some investment here in Nairobi with the Urban Light Railway, I think we know. But more can be done. And certainly the standard gauge railway, in my view, could be very transformational. You asked me to talk about that issue, that very, what I call the old chestnut of standard gauge versus narrow gauge. And really, the decision's been made to go with standard gauge. And I think that decision is a positive one and will pay in the long run. And we really think that if 40% of trade can get onto the rail, that's very good news for road. Because you know now the statistics, don't you? Look at how much trade's going to grow, how much stress that would put on our roads. And roads are expensive. I mean, broadly, about $1 million a kilometre. Okay? So, I mean, that investment will be good, I'm sure. And the important thing, I think, is to start thinking through what sort of levels of competition do we want to see on the rail. And that's quite an important question, because you could argue that will help a lot with the pricing. And the old narrow gauge will compete with the new standard gauge. So that's not a bad thing. But also, if we allow for open access on the standard gauge, I think that would help a lot. So that's something I think that the government's thinking through at the moment.
A couple of questions coming off Twitter. Somebody asking, what about the job losses of all these people working in customs and in the ports as you become more efficient? Are there not going to be a lot of job losses? And then another fellow in the tourism industry saying, can you just tell us a little bit about the single visa regime? And maybe I can take a couple more from the audience.
Thank you, Frank, for the presentation. My question is there any form of a race between Kenya and Tanzania as far as development is concerned in the EAC competition? The second question is, as far as integration is concerned, is Tanzania and Burundi slowing down the integration, or what is the race? Because we've been seeing a lot of cooperation between Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda of late, and less of Tanzania and Burundi in the picture. And my third question is, what are the what are the barriers of trade for Kenyan companies who want to expand to Ethiopia and South Sudan?
Thanks. Really good questions. Well, maybe I'll tackle those first, if that's okay. Well, look, you know, I'm a European. I was born in Europe. I was actually born in Belgium, of all places, and you know, I'm now British, right? So I'm a European, really, and my blood is, I've got Dutch blood, I've got Swedish blood, you know, from all over the place. So, and in Europe, you know, what you tend to find is that countries move at different speeds, okay? And in the end, the integration process should allow for that. So, your question about Tanzania and Burundi, are they slowing down the process? Actually, I think what's interesting is that Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and to a certain extent South Sudan with a trilateral have actually pulled progress forward. And I think that's really good news. But you could look at it like that, and that's the way I tend to prefer to look at it. And I was just in Burundi, you know, you saw that picture with the president launching the border post, very strong levels of commitment to the process moving forward. And I think in Tanzania as well. I was just there this week talking to the PS, Joyce Mapunjo, who heads up the effort. She's the PS within the East African Ministry. And the commitment's strong. It really is strong, and it's building. I think they are just a bit more cautious. And you might argue they have a right to be a bit cautious because when they compare themselves to Kenya, they can see that their human capacity, their human capital base is a bit lower. They can also see that their businesses are not as strong or not as big. So they may want to take a more gradual approach. I don't think there's anything really wrong with that. But if it slows down the overall process, that's when you need to get worried. And I think what's interesting is this last year has been quite a calibration. President Kikwete made a landmark speech in Dodoma saying, we commit to this. We're not going to walk away. We want to walk the road with you. And what's interesting for me since that speech is the big gains on the northern corridor are really beginning to happen now on the central corridor. And actually the pilots of the single customs territory are taking off. And I think that there's going to be a lot more action. You know, Tanzania is also now really looking seriously at its rail. And I think, you know, TRL as a central line linking up with Burundi and the Great Lakes is essential for unlocking that trade. So, you know, my own belief is, are they slowing down? Not really. I think the process does move at slightly different speeds. But I'd say that the community, over the 8 years I've been looking at it, now is more together than it's been for some time. But you could argue with me on that, I'm sure. And in terms of Kenya-Tanzania tensions, that was your question, are there tensions between Kenya and Tanzania? I think, you know, naturally, in any sort of partnership arrangement, there's going to be a few tensions here and there. At the moment, I don't think historically that's bad at all, actually. But I think, you know, everyone's mindful that Tanzania is going to go through an election process next year, and people are watching that process. I've certainly seen the number of non-tariff barriers and trade disputes really fall between the two countries. And the other thing I think, I don't know whether you're aware of this, but actually now Tanzania actually is running a trade surplus with Kenya, which I think is a very interesting statistic.
How's it doing that?
Sorry?
How's it done that?
It's done that through, I guess, growing its exports to Kenya. But, you know, that's happened. And that's something that's not often reported in the political media. But the trade statistics tell quite a lot of the story, that Tanzania has benefited actually rather a lot. It has. And so, you know, a lot of the work that we do in Tanzania is trying to bring over those benefits. And Aidenia Kuze, who I'm sure is watching, SID did a big piece of work looking at attitudes of Tanzanians towards Kenya. Very positive, Bwana. And how much of them are keen on integration? 85%. So I think, you know, we mustn't propound myths that are there that can be that are not accurate. So actually, I think Tanzania is very pro-integration. Basic evidence is they benefited a lot. What are the barriers to trade with Ethiopia and South Sudan? Well, I think with Ethiopia, the good thing is that Kenya, I guess, is part of COMESA. So COMESA has rules of origin and trade rules that allow Kenyan firms to export. But when you go to Addis Ababa, as I was about a month and a half ago, pretty much zero Kenyan goods on the shelves. A lot of potential there. If Ethiopia joined the EAC, that would become a lot deeper. You'd really move towards one single customs union. But the other thing I wanted to say was with South Sudan, I think the trade is generally better. It flows easier. And some of the work we've been doing in South Sudan, for example, is trying to harmonize South Sudan trade standards with the rest of the community. But, you know, that process will accelerate. But somebody asked me, a bit about, actually, what about trade in Africa? And I don't think I answered that question, actually. There's this thing called the tripartite free trade area. I don't know if you all know it, but it's really between COMESA, SADC, and EAC. And that will create a free trade area from Cape to Cairo in East and Southern Africa. And that will be agreed, the basic rules of origin and the other trade procedures will be agreed in January. So that's moved forward very quickly. And in my view, that's going to be the big challenge for us, is to make sure that that gets actualized. Because that'll increase the opportunities for businesses here to exploit that really large market. And it's a large market. But I think, you know, how is Africa integrating? The key challenge I see is, how does West Africa really integrate with East and Southern? Because you've really got two quite different trade regimes. And the AU at the moment is trying to think about how it can actualize this idea of a continental free trade area right across Africa, free trade, away you go. And I think that, you know, a lot of the effort in the next few years is going to be needing to think about West Africa. And I must say, I'm really excited because some donors have asked us to extend the TradeMark model to start thinking about how what we've learned here that's worked really well. I hope you can see. I really hope you can see that. They want to pilot that approach in West Africa. So one of the things that I'll be doing is giving a bit of advice to the preparatory work. So the kind of statistics you saw earlier about how much it costs to get XYZ to this place or that place, we are going to be doing that work with the government of Denmark over the next year. And if it does look feasible, we'll be looking to export some of the knowledge from here. So you're asking about East African exports. There you go. The TradeMark East Africa, what we've learned, we hope to extend to West Africa in particular. But I think that's going to be the key challenge for the continent.
You know, when the Secretary General was here talking about Tanzania, he said what the Tanzanians do is take a long time to change. But he says once they change, they don't flip-flop and change back. And he was saying that, you know, we'll change it, but then we'll flip back to what was pertaining before. I thought that was quite interesting. Question?
Thank you for this very interesting session. My question is, how sustainable are your projects and the systems that you put in place? Is there ownership among the countries that you're putting these systems in that will ensure that they are sustainable in the long run? Let's say, for instance, if TradeMark East Africa closes shop, will they still be up and running, or will they close up?
Yeah, I actually didn't answer that tourism thing either, did I? Lots of questions here. How sustainable? Well, I mean, first of all, if you come into my office sometime, I'll show you, in every project that we put forward is a sustainability plan. So that's built in from the start. And what's interesting about the way that we operate is we don't kind of say, we think this should be done, like some donors I could mention do. We actually sort of say, well, what do you think is the right solution here? So we tend to get a lot of people coming to us with ideas, and that's very positive. So the ownership from the beginning is very strong. And the sustainability plan is kind of worked out. Now that's different for different things. But I give you a good example in Burundi with the Burundi Bureau of Standards. Okay, you wouldn't think that this would be a good example, but it is actually quite a good example, where the Burundi Bureau of Standards said, look, we need to be able to test for cancerous toxins in food. At the moment, we have to send those samples to Nairobi and to Kigali. We want some equipment, Frank, to help us with that. And we're like, looking at the volumes of trade, we did a cost-benefit analysis. Okay, that makes sense. They've got the capacity to do it. We can help with some training. And then came the issue where there's no operational budget to maintain it or to bring in the materials to run those machines. Now, how far do you go? And in my view, the government needs to commit to those operational costs. You know, you can't do everything. So we said, well, we'll do it if you promise to make sure that the Ministry of Finance and the Revenue Authority, that you know that we have good links with, you know, guarantees you an income stream for those operational costs. That was agreed, the project went ahead. So that's the kind of level of scrutiny we do on these kind of things. With border posts, the really big infrastructure investments, we sign legal agreements with governments where they have to maintain it. And they're legally bound to do that for a period of years minimum. So we do try to put sustainability in. And I think the important point is, like when you think of really trying to do anything in trade, the key thing is to make sure that our partners have the capacity really to continue in the future. So a lot of the impact and evaluation work we do is around that sustainability plan. Okay, but no, we're quite rigorous on that, and certainly on the ownership side, it works very well. And part of the design of this new phase of our work, I'm going to be road showing next year all around the community, talking to people, asking them what they think needs to be done to shape our work. What I put up there is a working hypothesis. It's kind of, some ideas to kick things off. Single tourism visa, what is it? Well, it's one visa. If you come in as a tourist into Kenya, that would allow you to get free entry right across the community as a tourist. You don't then need to buy another visa in Burundi, or another one in Rwanda, or another one in Tanzania. Tanzania, by the way, signed up to it. As you said, once Tanzania is convinced, it does move, and it has moved. So what should it do? Well, it should mean that more regional packages for tourism can move forward, and actually the cost for tourists will fall, so it's a more attractive destination. I'm really proud that we've supported this whole process. We have we support a thing called the Tourism Platform that is on Twitter, by the way. And they do a great job at actually promoting East Africa as a single tourist destination, and I think with a lot of success.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
My name is David Mugambi. I'm from Kenya Investment Authority. I have one comment, two questions. My first comment was on the issue of insecurity and investments. Actually, up to last week, before the Mandela issue, our greatest threat to investment was Ebola. Up to us at, actually up to now, more investors are afraid of coming to Africa, especially from Asia, because of Ebola than because of insecurity. At least that's what, for the delegations that are coming, the ones who are cancelling are giving Ebola more of a reason. No one has given insecurity as a reason. To my questions, there's a new, you're working a lot on the corridor that already exists. There's a new one from Lamu to Ethiopia, South Sudan, the Matsaert issue. Do you have plans, or are you currently working on anything along that corridor? Especially now that the construction in Lamu has begun, probably systems that will be set up. Are you helping them set them up straight? My second question will be in the investment promotion area. Can you tell us more about what you're doing in encouraging investments? Especially, I'll be a bit selfish, in Kenya, now that we have subnational units, are you seeing any challenges that you can assist with in both trade and investment? Thank you.
My name is Eric. My question is about, mostly about the sugar imports that are supposed to come into Kenya. Is it going to affect the sugar industry in Kenya? Because we think that the farmers, this is going to have a negative impact on the Kenyan farmers, because the sugar from the East African community is much cheaper. And another question is about the integration of the East African Securities Exchange. What impact does it have on the capital markets of East Africa as a whole, and also in participation? Yeah.
Thank you.
My name is Jimmy. I'm an economist. Thank you for this interesting session. I have two questions, but they fall along the same theme. That's production capacity. So first question. In China, there are factory campuses. Mostly companies in the West, technology companies invest there and have most of the production done there. So are we looking to maybe attract those companies to Kenya so that we can have the same thing, maybe also across the region as well? Okay, and then another thing, there's always been this thing about skills mismatch. We always hear the same reasons being given by the same companies that try to invest in this region. So my question is, how are we tackling that? Are we maybe sending delegations to these companies and asking them what types of skills that they need in this region? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, crikey. Yeah, I love the fact that you all asked three questions at once. So I'm really struggling to keep up. I'll try my best, hey. One from the Kenya Investment Authority. Good to see you. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions, aren't there, about Ebola? I mean, isn't it kind of ironic that London is closer to West Africa than we are? And yet we're the ones being targeted. And I think that's really sad, actually, that there's that much lack of understanding. The fact that the biggest concentration outside of West Africa is actually the US, which is interesting in itself, and Europe. So, you know, I couldn't comment on that, but I do kind of lament that lack of understanding. And I personally commend the authorities very well for the responses. I've seen at many borders with Kenya, Ebola response teams testing people. They've tested me at the airport now. That's been upgraded. So I commend the government in its efforts there. So, but you know, whether that's insecurity is affected or not, I think you're more the expert than I am. But what I would say, though, is let's also reflect on the fact that Kenya is one of the biggest investors in East Africa. And I don't know whether, and I'm sure, Bwana, you could say a lot about that. But I think that that's also an important dynamic here.
What was the number you said, Kenya's FDI into East Africa? You gave a number?
I don't think I gave a number, no. I can't recollect the number on the top of my, but it's pretty high. I think it is a top investor, at least the statistics I saw. It is, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, Lapset. Yes, at the moment we're not working on Lapset because when I designed TradeMark, we it was just emergent at that time. We'll look at Lapset for the next phase of our operations. And as you said, it could become a really important corridor, and particularly for South Sudan and some of the oil. But it's a very ambitious project, and it encapsulates a lot of different moving parts, but it's very exciting. So it will be something that we look at in the next phase of our work. What are we doing on investment promotion? Well, I think at the moment we're not doing as much as perhaps we should. I'm certainly thinking in the next phase that investment promotion, when we try to think about where the growth is going to happen in the region, we try to do a lot more with agencies like your good selves. So that's something that we're aiming to do more of. But you can see that my good friend here that asked me how much are we doing, we can't do everything as a TradeMark East Africa. There are lots of specialist institutions like you that I think are very complementary to the work we're doing on trade costs. So hopefully that, and you asked me about some of the challenges to investment. I mean, I think I tried to put up that list of challenges, and I think those might apply to investment. But I don't think I need to reiterate them. But I think perception is one, and I personally, it's amazing when I first started talking to people in Europe about the Africa Rising story. The whole point that actually the potential in Africa is just great, and people should come and invest here. People thought we were a bit bonkers, but I think that's now well accepted. Really, it is. And you're seeing a lot of investment coming into the continent, which is really exciting. So I really hope you're capturing it for Kenya. Okay, sugar imports. Wow, that's a tricky question. Eric, yeah. I think. I mean, first of all, each country within the common external tariff policy has what's called an excluded goods list. I don't know whether you're aware of this. And under the negotiation of the customs union, actually countries are allowed to exclude tariff-free imports. Okay, and that common external tariff review is coming up next year. All right. So if Kenya feels that this is a particularly important issue for its farmers, it could look at that issue. But in the end, you could argue that the consumer would benefit from having lower prices. So you've got to sort of temper the benefits to farmers and consumers. That's all I'll say. I don't know how it stacks up, but it would be interesting to see that analysis. And I know it's been done, and people like, IEA have done some analysis, and they argue actually an import strategy opening up with a zero tariff strategy would be the right one to take. But that's due, you've probably seen that on Twitter from Kwame and others. Okay, and then you asked me about the East African Securities Exchange. What effect will this have? Actually, I think Ali Khan should answer that question. So I'm going to push that over to you because you're really the man on markets. But I would have thought a very positive thing.
Yeah.
It should increase, shouldn't it?
It should. I think, we're seeing lots of developments on the Securities Exchange here in Nairobi. We've seen a lot of progress, GEMS. We're going to have the introduction of currency futures, potentially a commodities exchange. So I think we're building a much more complex platform, particularly in Nairobi. I think Tanzania, interestingly, going back to the Tanzanian issue, they raised the restriction on foreign ownership at the stock exchange, caught everybody a little bit off guard. No one expected them to make such a move. So where I think it's going directionally is in the right place. I think, what happens, is it going to be a single platform? Will that be in Nairobi? I think other countries will find that a little bit difficult to handle, but I think we'll definitely have a major exchange, and I sincerely hope Nairobi proves to be it. But there's a lot of good progress in the capital markets, and I have to give them credit for that. I really think there's been a change around.
I go with you on that, and I think it's a very exciting potential. I mean, let's just talk about commodity exchanges. There's the commodity exchange in Kigali that's looking to take off, and I think there's a lot of really interesting things to think about when you think about a commodities exchange. Is how do you then provide legs for that exchange with farmers, and particularly when you're dealing with something like a commodity exchange, where say farmers in Mwanza might be wanting to sell to somebody in Kisumu, the information gap between them is huge. So they have to have so much confidence in the exchange. It's a bit like M-Pesa if you think about it. You know, without having confidence in Safaricom, would you send your precious money down into a mobile phone? I mean, it's a question, isn't it? So the confidence has created that product, and I think that is actually a very interesting challenge for the commodity exchange people, is how do they get the legs towards, you know, of an exchange like that near to farmers, creating a product that they can trust. I think it's a very interesting challenge.
And you also have to have the whole sort of infrastructure and architecture around it, right? The storehouse, the ability to store, to get some financing, to go to the market when you want to.
Warehouse receipting, and then how do you know the maize you're buying is the right quality maize? You see, there's really quite an interesting set of challenges there that go beyond just the straight financial transaction. It's interesting, actually, that when I was in Kigali, they were telling me that the price on the exchange was below that of the open market. Now, why would that be?
And what was their reason?
Well, I think it was uncertainty about quality. And I think that that's actually a real issue, isn't it? If you think about it, you need to know what you're buying. Otherwise, would you buy it? And that is quite an important question.
On the coffee markets, on the global coffee
Yep.
markets, when people took delivery of the coffee, it was all safe. So there was a huge scandal saying, we're paying the right price for something, but it's not right.
So you know, there are complexities around creating exchanges like that you need to kind of think through. And actually, M-Pesa, you know, is actually quite a good, you know, you think about how they solve that. It's interesting. It applies to that kind of product. Okay, it's skills mismatch, and how to attract companies to Kenya. Well, I mean, I'm personally always a believer that skills development and schools and everything there should be outreach to companies, because in the end, people coming out of the schools or universities need to find jobs, and you know they need to have skills that are really close to what industry wants. So I think it's quite important, and I think in Kenya that there is a lot of this going on, is that universities or secondary education or even technical vocational training needs to have a good link into industry and service sectors. And actually, apprenticeships sound kind of old-fashioned, but that's really important. And terrible statistics, I think, here in Kenya. Somebody told me the other day it takes, on average, between 7 and 9 years to find your first job. So, you know, for many graduates, that's really a big problem, and we need to think a lot more about how that's solved. And you're a pretty young group. I don't know what your experience is, but I'd be interested to hear. And I think, you know, making skills much more demand-led from business is really important. I know in some countries around the community, this is a major thing that they're looking at. And in the end, you guys, the young guys around East Africa, you know, we got to find jobs for you. To me, that's the biggest challenge that's out there, really. And how to attract.
The government's going to be able to create the number of jobs we have to go and create them ourselves.
Well, I think everyone has a role to play. I don't think you can say that government can do everything. Yeah. I don't think it can. But I think the private sector has a very big role to play. And I think that surely is an exciting challenge. Is that being fully addressed? Is everything like that really happening? I think more could be done. And attracting companies to Kenya, well, I'd put my challenges slide back up to you a bit, but you know, Kenya is really a regional center for East Africa. A lot of companies are investing here to look at that East African market. And if you think about the transformations we've seen even in the 8 years I've been here, they've been massive, haven't they? You've seen massive investment from internationals. Every week I read about another company putting money in. So I think companies are being attracted, but I think obviously more could be done. And you know, I think some of the reforms that we've been talking about this morning are ones that could catalyze that. So you know, I don't know. I would like to come back to you with my question, maybe at the end. Yes. Is do you feel that we're on the cusp of a new era? Are we on the cusp of unleashing this East African lion? You know, is the economy really going to take off from here? Because if you read a lot of the stuff from the World Bank and others, and I do subscribe to it, is that a lot of the indicators for takeoff have kind of now been passed. And my question to you is, do you think, are you as optimistic as someone like me?
Yeah, now let's do a show of hands on that, because also I meet a lot of people who come from Asia, and they're saying, look, we all know this is a similar story to what Asia was, however many years ago. Somebody was describing to me going to China in the early 90s and saying that, it was no different to somewhere like Africa. You'd go there and you think, there's nothing here, trying to send companies there, saying, what are you talking about, all riding bicycles? And then suddenly you get this massive surge. But saying they weren't seeing that same sort of strength and muscularity that they saw come out of China. Let me throw one question I'm going to take. I know I've got a couple of questions to take there before I wrap up. Dambisa Moyo famously wrote this book, Trade Not Aid, and I suppose TradeMark is philosophically aligned with that kind of thinking. Does aid still have a role to play in Africa, or is it at the end of the day commercial and we just forget aid because we never know what the return on it is? And then is it appropriate for Bob Geldof to be doing a song like he's doing 30 years later? Sorry. I have to go down there because I neglected them.
Some good tough questions.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
My name is Preston. Thanks so much for coming here. And I have several questions, in fact, if you forgive me. First of all, you've talked about being able to reduce the time it takes a truck to move from Mombasa to Kampala from, was it 18 days to 6 days, right? Question is, how has this come to benefit the population? I get that the cost of production for the company has gone down, but how has it translated into the cost of goods actually going down? And another question, you realize that it costs $50 to get a visa into Zanzibar, both for an African, East African, and for the European. What are the advantages that this single tourism, what are the advantages that this free trade area is going to benefit as Africans so that we don't have to pay same price as other people from other regions? And there has been an interesting conversation on the papers, especially between the former minister, Bitange Ndemo, about the translation of big projects such as Konza City that's coming up into the economy in terms of long-term progress. Bitange is of the idea that as much as these projects are going to translate into big economic growth, it's going to be a one-off event that doesn't translate in the years after the project is completed. What is your position on this matter? And, final question. Sorry, I have to ask so many questions. Final question. You talk of projects that are about to lead to growth of jobs up to about 11 million jobs and 5 million jobs in different situations. And the unemployment rate in Kenya, I would take the assumption that it's at 40%. How is this 11 million jobs going to bridge the unemployment rate, considering the fact that the population is growing at the employable population is growing at almost the same rate? Thank you so much.
Yeah, you certainly packed a few in there. No, but I think it's good to be cheeky, and that's good. Okay, I mean, just to answer your question, that 5 million jobs target is just the draft that I'm doing. Okay, so that's not the definitive, but that's the kind of target that we're going to be aiming to achieve. All right. So let me caveat that. All right, because you've all taken that up, but it's not written in stone. I just wanted to say that, because we're doing some work with the World Bank on what the effect of all those things I talked to you about would be. So I want to base that not on fiction, but on fact, on potential evidence. Look, I mean, I think the jobs question is a really important one, and population growth is happening without a doubt, as you said. So the target's getting tougher and tougher and tougher. I think organizations like mine can do what we can do, but I think the important point is that the economy needs to take up that challenge, and clearly authorities. So I don't really know that I can answer that in any better way than to say that. But the more that we address some of the key systemic challenges, the more that job creation is possible. And that's the important point, is as a young person maybe wanting to start your own business, if you can't find employment, how can you do that in a way that's simple and that your market and your income is assured? And I think that that's perhaps a question that I'd throw back at you a bit. All right. In terms of infrastructure, I don't know, have you ever tried to build anything or a house? I mean, it takes a long time to build something. I'll just tell you, I have experience of that. And you know, the fact is, if you want to build it properly, you need to have a good tender process. That takes time. And you need to make sure that the people that build it have the requisite skills to build it. Let me tell you a story about, I put a tender out with TradeMark, where we put a tender out for 4 bridges, to construct 4 bridges. The tenders we came back were from some companies that claimed they built things when they just downright lied. Now, I mean, you know, when you have a tender process and a good one, you need to check those things. So it does take time to do it. And I think, you know, if you suddenly think that a highway can emerge without a good tender process or a good feasibility study process, I think you're kind of dreaming. So you do need to invest in those things. So that, you know, what we've found is that infrastructure takes time to put into place. Is it a one-off? Well, it depends on your plan, doesn't it? But I would say that just inherently, infrastructure is something that takes time. But this IMF study, which I really think you should have a look at, shows the effect of those cumulative investments in certain types of infrastructure, particularly transport, can be very high, very high. And this IMF study found that those sort of investments can yield growth immediately, but then the longer term effect aggregates, it becomes higher. So I don't want to comment on any other political discussions, but you know, as somebody, as an institution that does infrastructure, those are the kind of challenges that we face. It does take time. And you know, if you want to get a good piece of infrastructure, you shouldn't hurry it too much. I think that's important. Okay, you said the time to Mombasa, to Kampala, 18 to 6 days. I mean, a lot of that is down to some of the nuts and bolts work that we do, but you know, the Secretary General's work on the single customs territory has been really important in that. So it's a mixture between like physical stuff and also policy. How does it benefit? Well, again, I could get academic and say there have been lots of cross-country studies that have showed if you reduce the time and the cost of trade, it increases trade. But I'm not going to bother to talk about that, but there's quite a lot of cross-country correlations that show that. But essentially, what's the pathway? I think it's a bit like the Rwanda single window story I told you about earlier, that you can reduce the time, that reduces the cost of bringing in a container, and that reduces the cost of the commodity, and that's where consumers see a lot of benefit. That's one. But another one would be for exports where the cost of the container comes down and a company suddenly becomes competitive in getting its good out to a regional market. Then it maybe brings in more people and jobs are created. So there are different pathways to that kind of impact. But you know, what we found is that, you know, one hindrance, of course, is, you know, you can reduce the time, but companies may not reduce the price because they may make more profits. And I think there's a serious question there about some segments of our logistics industry that need to become more competitive. And I won't say more than that, but this LIFT fund that we launched, and we're launching around the region over the next couple of weeks, this is the Logistics Innovation for Trade, tries to bring in ways of increasing competition and reducing the cost structure. Okay? So, I mean, I hope that answers your question, but we could have quite a debate about that for a whole day, just that one subject. And in fact, we recently run a trade poverty symposium here in Nairobi with, I think we had about 200 people from around the region where we debated this. I wish you'd been there. It would have been useful maybe. And listen, I mean, just the cost of visa, I mean, I'm sorry to hear about Zanzibar for you, but pity me. Think about the cost that I've incurred this last week, okay? I went to Rwanda where I had to pay a $30 visa when I was in transit coming from Burundi where I had to pay a $50 visa, and Tanzania where I was this week I paid $50. Now if I'd have been a tourist I would have just bought my visa in Kenya for, I think it's now what, $30? I would have saved myself all that money. So doesn't that make a bit of a difference? I think it could. All right, Ali. Bob Geldof. This is another one of Mr. Aiden's questions from Twitter. I recognize this one. Well, look, I think, I mean, there's been a lot of comment about Bob Geldof's initiative, and I think it's well-meaning. My gut feeling is Bob Geldof's got a huge heart and, you know, a lot of respect for the man, and he kicked off something that was, I think, a long time ago. Whether it's appropriate to Africa's needs, I was quite happy to see the private sector committing large amounts of money to the Ebola challenge, and I feel that maybe a more African-owned process would be better. And I mean, I think things have moved on, but maybe Bob was just trying to be kind and using a brand that seemed to work. Okay, so I think you can level criticism, but you've got to say the guy's got a warm heart and it's going to do some good, isn't it? But maybe the private sector commitment from African businesses, I thought was very significant and very positive. And I hope you chipped into that, Ali Khan. Yeah. But no, just joking. But I think the issue about does aid have a role, I think it's a really important one maybe to dwell on a bit, because the way I look at it is that, you know, development's definitely changing, and development aid. And I think now a lot of practitioners in the development industry are thinking, well, much more about how aid can unlock a private sector response. And I think the days of having huge grant funds are changing. I think all the aid agencies I work with are much more interested in thinking about how the sustainability issue that I was asked about, and how you can create something that uses commercial capital much more. So really you've got to think about, well, what's the role of that subsidy? Because in the end, if you're trying to get the private sector moving, aid is a subsidy, isn't it? And subsidies can distort markets, but they can also help. And let's go back to M-Pesa. I mean, M-Pesa is actually quite an interesting example. I used to work with DFID, the UK government, and actually M-Pesa got off the ground with a £500,000 grant to Vodacom. And that grant was given to let that company take a risk, to actually develop something that they considered to be quite risky. They didn't know how it would work out. Their management wasn't willing to take that risk, but then the grant allowed it to happen. Okay? They took the risk, developed the product, and I think the rest is history. So really thinking in a much smarter way about how you can use grants to leverage responses. That's the kind of thing that we spend quite a lot of time thinking about. Because again, if you give free things, that can erode a market or a product very heavily. And I think personally aid agencies are waking up to that. And I think, as you said, the link between aid and trade is very important. I mean, the Aid for Trade movement that was started by Pascal Lamy is all about trying to get sustainable solutions. So, you know, basically trying to get trade moving to create development. And I'm personally, you know, TradeMark, or, you know, is pretty much was set up with that ethos center stage.
I'd like to thank Frank for being such an interesting, engaging guest. Linus's Gitahi is asking, does it really take 7 to 9 years for this graduate to find a job? Which is an extraordinary number, isn't it? And I think the lesson then is we got to get our jobs ourselves, because Frank, really, really fascinating, and I hope you can stay around for a few minutes in case anybody wants to talk with you and probably get your business card. I'm really grateful to Frank for this very interesting discussion. You know, at the end of the day, I remember the East African, which was an airline, wasn't it? East African? In the 70s, like 77 or something. And I remember thinking to myself, you know, really, we're all East Africans. That's the key thing. We're not Kenyans or Tanzanians. And I sincerely hope that your efforts at TradeMark go towards building a single community, a single economy, and that, as you say there, that we finally unleash what I know is the East African lion. So thank you, Frank, very much.
No, thank you very much, and maybe just do that show of hands, okay? Yes. So are you an optimist or a pessimist, essentially?
About East Africa?
Yeah, so people who are optimistic, put your hand up. Okay, can we have some pessimists, please?
Any pessimists?
Oh, okay, the one man in the back. Hey. Okay, so I think you've really done the voting, and I just want to say huge thanks.
I think we're just a very optimistic forum.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks very much. Excellent.